sometimes people say, like, I don't want to leave here because I'm in such a beautiful feeling. I'm like in this bubble of love. And you're in the bubble of love because you're love. I forget who it was that said, maybe it was Lise that said in the nature of love, when you and Amanda were doing the nature of love, or something like that, and it was about insight, and somebody was wondering, like, how do we gain more insight? And you came up with, we are insight. And the whole room just stilled with that knowledge. We are insight. You know, we are good enough. And I love for you all to embrace that more. That when you go home in your bubble of love, like what Gabriella said this morning, how she's noticing more. And she goes out into her garden and she's in the moment in her garden. Like, that's living in our bubble, living in our wisdom, living in our divinity, living in our spiritual heritage. It's not just when we come to these events, beautiful as they are, the catalyst that they are, but how could you feel the feeling here if you already weren't that bubble of love? That's our evidence. You know, and the more we see that, and the more we honor that, the more we live in that bubble of love. It's the same with our true nature and consciousness and thought and mind. I remember a situation that happened maybe a year or two before Sid passed, and Chip and I were doing conference calls for a large group of people. And it was kind of new to Chip and I to do these calls. A client had set it up, and there were probably 100 people on the line. And then we would talk with Sid after, and we were excited, sharing what we were learning and what insights people were gaining, and they wanted Sid to be involved. And Sid said, no, you know, that's not for me. You and Chip carry on and do that. And so we thought, okay. But then after a few days of reflection, Sid said, so when is the next one? And he invited us to his office so we could all be on the call together. And he said, you and Chip start off and I'll be in the background. And I ended up starting off, and I started off about consciousness, that I had seen something, I'd gained some insight, but I was relating it to consciousness, you know, awareness, as if it wasn't mine. Like I was talking about consciousness with a big C. You know, like this divine consciousness, universal consciousness. And Sid said, Elsie, it's your consciousness. It's your consciousness. You're part of divine consciousness. So own it. It's yours. Cherish it. It's yours. And I went into shock. Like, it was like, whoa. Because that was too big for me. You know, that was too big to say. And if that's so, you know, what I see now is, how can we not be good enough? How can we not have the answers inside of us? How can we not feel what we feel here, and even more in our home, in our garden? You know, wherever we are, flying on the plane, where you're in that bubble, how can we not feel that? And so when Sid said that to me, like, you know, in such an adamant voice, like, your consciousness, it's your consciousness that shifted. It's your true nature. It's like, whoa. And then he said, like, you know, carry on. It's like, over to you, Chip. You know, I couldn't say anything more. I couldn't say anything more. But it lingered with me, and it's lingered with me to this day, where more and more I started to see that people come in off the streets, people just are drawn to that love in us. So when we see that, how can we think, I'm not good enough? And when is enough enough? I'm going to say this with respect, that sometimes, like, enough is enough. And you don't want to keep going to more and more and more trainings, right? Because you want to leave space for you. And I know on one hand it's lovely, you know, there were people at my event in London, there were people at Jack's event, and there are people here. And it's like you're overflowing with this wealth of information. When is it enough? With all due respect and with love, when is it enough for you to say, me too? Me too. What have I got? You know, what's new in me that didn't come from here? What's new to me when I'm looking at the new growth on the cherry tree? You know, that young woman that sat in one of our breakout sessions that said something about the supportive space. That's us. We're our supportive space. And I know how seductive it is to keep going to all these enriching events. Me too. When we, as you know, Jack said, when the first conferences or the first events that Sid did, we just followed him around everywhere. And finally he'd say, like, you again? Like, you're here again? Go home. Just live. And I remember one time he was off to Vancouver again and I'm on the island, and he said, Elsie, just go home. You know, be with your husband, be with your family. Just go home. Live it. Stop talking about it. Live it. If that's the only thing, honestly, that I can convey in my sharing in this last session, it's that you're more than enough. We're all more than enough. And the best way you will help the world is by acknowledging that in yourself, by honoring that in yourself, and then that is going to ripple out to the world like you wouldn't believe.
You want me to follow that? Once I caught on to the fact that there is no way to do it. The only way to do it is what we see for ourselves in our own hearts. The feeling that we have within us is the feeling that comes out to other people. That's enough. And always in my so-called trainings since then, I've always attempted to help people see that what they have inside of them is just as much or more than I have inside of me. And when we sit down with another person or sit in front of a group like this, what do we have? What we know. What we know, what we feel. And that's what comes out to other people. And that is so enough.
Yeah.
And as I think I heard Sid first say that it's like a teardrop in the ocean. You know, once that teardrop falls into the ocean, it has all the power of the ocean behind it. That's us.
beautiful. I love when this silence unfolds like this. I just love it. It's such a gift, isn't it? It's the manifestation of all our souls. The legacy of this understanding of this precious gift continues to filter out to the world in such a clear, clean, pure manner, with originality and with everybody's unique voice, that everybody is finding their unique voice. And what's so interesting about that is everybody has their own unique voice to share what's real to them, and yet it's all the same. You know, the underlying message is always the same, even though it's said in an original way that is meaningful to each of us. And that's really interesting, that we can have one source underlying all of our unique voices and all of our unique original way of voicing what is real to us. And how powerful just one insight can be. Like that was all I had when I first started to share this. And so if those of you who are really new, I know some people have just come in, this is their first event, and I think what a wonderful event to come into that is so relaxed, so loving, so kind, so gentle, you know, and siesta in the middle of it. I mean, what more could you ask? That's like the best of both worlds, you know. To me, that's kind of the connection between form and formless, is siesta, you know. And so for people to come into that, and they may have had one insight and be in this bubble of love, and then they think, you know, okay, like I don't want to leave here because what's waiting for me at home? But if you've had one insight, that's a permanent shift for you. That's what these precious gifts offer. One insight is permanent. You'll never lose it. Even though, again, sometimes it may get clouded up by our personal thinking, insight lasts forever. And that one insight I had, thought creates feeling, right? I mean, you've all had that insight one way or another, however it's come to you. It still had legs 38 years later. Some of you will have heard this story. Will you permit me to share it again for some of the new people? When I had that first insight, thought creates feeling, I realized sort of after the fact that that was the principle of thought that Sid was sharing with Ken and I. And that's all I got, you know, that's all I got. I got the feeling of I'm enough. I got the feeling of I'm worthy for the first time. I got the feeling of there is purpose to life. But I didn't know that mind and consciousness were in unison bringing that insight to me until 38 years later. You know, and when I think about it, I love the humor of that. That here's this little senior lady sitting here on the stage saying, oh yeah, like 38 years later I realized to a degree that the three principles are one. How cool is that? How is that not enough? You know what I mean? Like when you get your insights, wow, like how is that not enough? That you're experiencing your own divinity in that moment of insight. That then encourages you to leave more space for more without wanting more, but knowing that when you leave that space, there is more. You know, it's that saying of Sid's doing without doing. This is like more without wanting more. More just appears. And you begin to, in just living more fully, and just, you know, loving your home and your family and nature and everything around you and people, just everything around you, where you begin to live in a world of insight. How is that not enough? I remember a client who has become a dear friend came to me in London during the break, and it wasn't easy finding breaks, right, with 1,000 people, Jack. Mm-hmm. And he came up to me, and I could see that emotionally he was really moved. And he said, "Could I just take you off into a corner here?" And I said, "Yes." And we sat down, and he could barely speak. He was just so full. And he said, "I've just realized I'm enough." I swear. He said, "I just realized I'm enough." And he wept. Because like all of us, he had thought he wasn't enough. Mm-hmm. And that realization changed his life again. He's written a book. He started his own business. And he certainly found his voice. How is that sitting with you? That, you know, makes sense to you, the feeling of I'm enough, I'm more than enough? Yeah. Good.
And even if anybody sitting here has not had any insights, which is fine, the feeling that you're sitting here with, I just want to underscore what Elsie said earlier. The feeling itself is enough. Because some people could think, oh my God, I haven't had any insights. Well, that doesn't matter because you're sitting in the feeling of an insight. And who knows what happens when you leave? It's almost like this feeling prepares the mind for having insights. I mean, I've had a lot of insights after I left things like this, you know.
Something struck me when you said that, Jack, that the more we do live in that feeling, the less I'm interested in my thinking or anybody else's thinking.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And I really, really love that. That so often when I talk with people, they're so wise, and they see, you know, when Gabriella was talking about seeing this morning, and they will say to me, like, I see that my thinking, that I'm into my thinking about my relationship or about my work or about money, but it's not really helping me because they're focused on their thinking rather than their seeing. Mm-hmm. I'm not interested in their thinking. I'm really not. With respect, I'm not interested in their thinking. At one time, I used to be. Mm-hmm. I used to be quite fascinated by my thinking and by everybody else's thinking because I never knew anything about thinking or thought, you know, so it was a whole new, novel thing for me to explore until I started to discover that I was getting caught up in it, you know, slippery slope, this thinking stuff. And then I became aware of the seeing bit and how powerful seeing is, that's enough. And again, I remember Sid saying to me about the nature. He said it's fine and well to talk about what the principles do, but it's the nature of the principles. That's where the gold is. Well, what's the nature? What does that mean? And he said, so just, see what comes to you. And I said, I don't know, Sid. I don't know what that means. I don't know how I could talk about the nature of the principles or of life or, what does that mean? Nature to me was the greenery outside, the trees and the bushes, And he said, well, try and tell me what it means to you. I can't. The only thing I can say is when you talk about it, I get a sense of it. And I think Rudi talked about the majesty several times in his talk, the majesty. And that's the sense I got of our true nature, or the true nature of the principles, is the majesty of it. But it was only a sense of it, right? That's as far as I could go. He said, that's good enough. That's good enough. If you've got a sense of our true nature and of the true nature of life, that's a degree of knowing. Not belief. It's a degree of knowing, true knowledge. And I felt that, like I felt the truth of that. But I still didn't know what to do with it, right? So at that point, it's like I felt it, but it wasn't quite good enough. I didn't feel equipped to that. Now what? A couple of days later, I get a call from a regular client who was a VP of operations of a big organization, and he was really upset. They were going through a lot of separations, having to let people go, employees go, as they were downsizing their company. And he said, Elsie, I'm really upset. He said, I know it's my thinking about what's going on, but he said, right now, that's not good enough. That's not helping me. What else do you have in your bag of tricks? Well, the only thing I could pull out was, and I couldn't say anything about it, so I said to him, so, well, if I say to you, what comes to mind for you when I say, what's the nature of the principles and of life? And there's this pause, a very meaty pause. And then he comes back and he said, it feels spiritual to me. Now this is a VP of operations. We've never talked spiritual before. We've talked pretty deep, but we've never talked about the nature of the principles because I didn't know what to do, what to say. And I've never really talked spiritual, very little. And he came up with that. And it just elevated our whole conversation in that hour-long engagement. By the time we got off, I felt like I was floating, and he told me the same thing, and he went back into his work with just a total different state of mind in how to deal with the issues that were facing him and his company. And so did I. And I loved that because I learned from him. And that started my journey in being able to share a little more from that experience about the nature of the principles. And that if you just get a sense of what that is, you get a feeling of the truth of it, that's good enough. And I love that. In what other educational process can you go, right? Like if you went to a university and you were studying theories of math, And they said, if you just get a sense of this, that's good enough. I don't think that would be the way it unfolded. But with this understanding, that's the way it goes. If you get a sense of the truth behind it, it doesn't matter if you don't understand it. And that's the other thing for those of you that are really new to this. It doesn't matter if you don't understand this. You still benefit by it. And I don't think there's anything else in the world that you don't have to understand the system or the workings of it in order to benefit by it. And that's more than good enough.
I can say something to that. I've heard a lot of people say, I don't know whether I know enough to be a coach of somebody or to teach. And just think about this for a second. All we have to do is sit with someone in love, get out of the picture in our own minds, and it's healing. That's enough. It's all we have to do.
Thank you. Thank you. That's lovely.